welcome back to the Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio. For those newly joining the show, my name is Irina Zuckerman, and I am the editor-in-chief of the Washington Outsider. With us today is Fernando Carvajal. He's an expert on Yemen who's done extensive field work in Yemen, nearly 20 years of research, and he served on the UN Security Council's panel of experts from April 2017 to March 2019 as an on-groups and regional experts, and now he's involved with the center that study with an American Center for South Yemen Studies, and we'll get to what that is in a moment. We'll be discussing an issue that's been quite prominent in the headlines lately, the issue of the Saudi geopolitical shift in normalizing with Iran, in extending relations to various Iranian allies and proxies in the region, and what the impact of it is for Yemen specifically in light of the recent negotiations, as well as for the regional security framework. We are seeing several things happening: normalization with Iran itself, potential normalization with Syria, meetings with groups like Hamas inside Saudi Arabia, and extended efforts to negotiate and settle a peace deal with the Houthis in Yemen. How that all comes together, if it is, that's what we're going to find out today from Fernando. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation.
Before we delve into the main topic, if you could tell us how you became interested in Yemen and how you ended up doing the research there that brought you to the United Nations, ultimately, I think that would be very interesting to our audiences.
Long story, but thank you. Right, the summer of 2000 is when I was invited to Sanaa to work part-time at the Yemen Language Center in Old Sanaa in Tahrir area. It's a small language center, and I went there as I was doing my master's to learn Arabic for the first time. I had just taken some background courses, introduction courses at the university, but I was invited to work part-time and then take some classes at the same time. This was the summer of the year 2000. And it was fascinating to me, my first visit to the Arab world, to an Arab country, and just walking out of the airport into the city, Sanaa, bustling, everything at 6 o'clock in the morning when my flight arrived. And it was just fascinating experience that summer. I was there for about 2.5 months. And then I started doing research toward the end of July. I was fascinated with the tribal system, the development of the democratic system, the reforms that were taking place, obviously conflict that has engulfed the country for decades. And then I made such great contacts through local journalists that were working for papers like the Yemen Times, it was a first English newspaper in Yemen. And the level of hospitality, the friendships that developed, and it just, evolved into this long project, researching, working at the Yemen Language Center another 3 or 4 times in the summers. And finally, I was nearly living full-time around 2010. The year 2010, I was living in Sanaa nearly full-time. And what do you know, in January, when I land back in Sanaa, January 2011, is the beginning of the Arab Spring, right? The beginning of the protest. And I was in Sanaa nearly the whole time in 2011. And I just continued to do research. I was fortunate enough that I knew so many Yemenis welcomed me in their home, at work, and to help my research, to help me understand the country. It kept going into 2013. The last time I was there, was April 2014. So just about, before the origins of the current conflict, right? And I kept studying, I kept writing, and in 2016, late 2016, I was invited to apply for the position of armed groups expert at the UN panel. And based on someone at the UN having read some of my articles about the conflict and the history. And I was invited to join the panel in March of 2017. And I spent 2 great years working with the UN and reconnecting with Yemenis everywhere in Egypt, the Gulf, Amman, Europe, and the US. It was a wonderful experience. And I hope that in somehow I had a bit of a contribution with my research and what I wrote during my time at the UN.
You mentioned interesting things because I think most people who are aware of Yemen's role in global geopolitics today, at the latest, they started watching the events since the Arab Spring. As a matter of that, and most people probably didn't really pay attention until the civil war broke out. But I am curious to hear your insights on the history of the conflicts way before all of them became an issue. What was going on circa 2000 when you first got in? What was the nature of these conflicts, and what was the nature of the armed groups at the time? Because my understanding is that they were quite fluid. The groups that we know today, I mean, the Houthis were the Houthis, but some of the other groups, such as the Southern Transitional Council, some of the tribal alliances, even Al-Islah, were not quite exactly as structured as we understand them today. So if you could give us some background about that.
Right. So to frame a little bit of what I just told you, my experience and my history there, keep in mind that the summer of 2000 was just before the October bombing of the USS Cole in Aden, correct? By Al-Qaeda. So, I was there until August of 2000. Then you have the USS Cole, and then I returned to Sanaa in December of 2000, which was Ramadan, the holy month of Ramadan at that time. And it was so interesting for me because at that time when I went back to Sanaa in December of 2000, a friend of mine, a young journalist that I befriended from the Yemen Times, he was from Marib, and he organized some interviews for me in Sada. So for most people that don't know, Sada is a province in the north that borders Saudi Arabia. And this is traditionally, it was, the entry point for Zaidi, for the Zaidi sect, let's call it, of Islam over 1,000 years ago. And this was, and today it is seen as the seat of Zaidi Islam for Yemen, right? And this happens to be the center where Beit al-Houthi, the Houthi family, had settled in Sada. But interesting enough, the reason why I went to Sada in December 2000, was to meet the head of the Salafi group. One of the Salafi in Yemen was fairly new in its interaction with the local population. So in the late 1960s, Sheikh Moqbil al-Wadai brought basically Salafia as an ideology, as an approach, as dawah, the calling to Islam. And he settled in Sada because he knew the importance of Sada, and he knew the growth of Zaidi Islam in Sada. So strategically speaking, he positioned himself within, Zaidi Islam in order to advance his goal of the Salafi dawah. And he settled his first center in Damaj, which is just maybe 15 minutes away from the capital city of Sada itself. So you can already picture the beginning of the tension between Zaidi Islam, which is considered a Shia wing of Islam, and Salafi, which is the Sunni part of Islam. And excuse me. And so this history of conflict begins with that intrusion, quote unquote, as local Zaidis would see it. And often there would be clashes between the two camps. The Maj was known also as a gravity center for foreigners that wanted to study Islam. Interesting enough, this center in Damaj was a transit point for the American jihadi that was captured in Afghanistan by the US following the 9/11 attacks here in the US. And so, it was a center of learning. I met a lot of foreigners when I was there, from England, from Western Europe, from the US, Asia as well, some from Africa. And it was a learning center that was very popular for Muslims in the Sunni world. And if we skip all the way to 2013, during the time of the national dialogue process, this is where the Houthis begin to see an opportunity to escalate and position themselves politically. And their first renewed battle, let's call it, was in the Maj. So in 2013, the Houthis boycott the conclusion of the national dialogue process, which was part of the transition from the Arab Spring. And they begin to clash with tribes and students from the Maj Institute, from the Salafi Institute, to the point where between August and December of 2014, the Houthi militia at that point and their tribal allies managed to expel all the Salafis from the Maj. And this is the beginning of a huge political crisis for the former president, Abdurrahman Mansour Hadi. So you imagine the whole entire village of the Maj being displaced, whether it was Yemenis or foreigners. They're forced to leave, first to Hodeidah, then to Amran, and then to Sanaa, the capital. The history of Zaidi Islam, we have to, you can Google this, hopefully, and get more information. There's a lot of good stuff online, but basically Sanaa was ruled by a Zaidi Imam for over 1,000 years, right? And on and off with occupation from the Ottoman Empire in the 1500s, late 1400s, 1500s, and then again in the mid 1800s to 1917, 1918. There's a long history, and we can spend a whole week discussing this history, but it is important to note because this is what today's Houthi, this is what the Zaidi Houthi family today tries to reach back to the history of the Zaidi Imamate, which basically ended in 1967 following about 5 years of civil war between the royalists, those that were supporting the Zaidi Imam at the time, Muhammad Hamid ad-Din, and the new Jumhuris, the new Republicans, who were represented by the military personnel that conducted a coup, and then it leads into a revolution from 1962 to 1967. So the Houthis today, their patriarchs really reach back to the Hamid ad-Din imamate, which is between 1904 and 1967, as their legitimacy, as their justification for ruling from Sanaa. And again, we can get into the way that the Houthis have drafted their narrative for justifying their right to rule. But also we need to be conscious that in today's world, in today's Yemen, we do have that mix of Yemeni Zaidi Islam in the approach taken by Houthis, influenced by Iranian Shiism, Twelver Shiism, their ideology, their approach, their narrative vis-a-vis the international community and the region, not just Saudi Arabia and Israel, but the Arab world. And one of the things I I've done a lot of extensive research on Zaidi Islam. A lot of my research for years, over a decade, had focused on the way that the Zaidi imamate of the Hamid ad-Din family legitimized their right to rule and how they created a state. So the modern state of Yemen really begins to be imagined and being constructed in the mid 20th century, or 1930s to 1962. But today, because Zaidi Islam depends on the presence and the leadership of that imam as the political and religious and military ruler, Zaidis in Yemen have not been led by an imam since 1967, right? Until now. So what we see with the Houthis today is trying to figure out if modern Yemen should experience a modern imamate, or if they should adapt the Iranian model of Wilayat al-Faqih, which is the rule by the learned ulama, the learned sheikhs, in which Yemen itself and Zaidiyah had a limited experience, because in the late 1700s to early 1800s, we see the Qasimi imamate developed the idea of the diwan of Sheikh al-Islam, the reliant not so much as a mufti in Sunni Islam, but to create the position of Sheikh al-Islam, which was the one religious sheikh who interpreted and enforced religious doctrine, basically. And today the Houthis are basically living that dilemma, trying to figure out if, in fact, someone like Abdul Malik al-Houthi, the leader of the Houthi family of the movement, should become an imam and therefore the ruler of Yemen from a religious approach, or if they should adapt a system close to the Iranian system where they have a political leadership that is then supported by clerics, right? By Zaidi clerics. And to this, we have to mention that their idea of the ruling cleric class is limited to the Hashemis, the descendants of the Prophet, all the families that are descended from the Prophet. And these families, the learned clerics from those families, would then become the base for the consultative council, the government itself, but still, like in Iran, having a president and a cabinet to actually govern and sustain relations with the outside world. We can spend ages, not just hours, talking about this. It's very fascinating, and today it's a little bit complicated in trying to decipher what the Houthis actually want to do. We know for sure they want to rule Yemen. We just don't know exactly how they want to go about that.
Well, it sounds that if they themselves are not entirely sure, that then for outsiders to try to divine from the conflicting rhetoric, that could be even more difficult. But that said, is there a decision-making mechanism to ultimately come to that decision, or is this infinite process likely only to add to internal conflicts within the family? And if so, what do you envision that being like if there is a conflict over the governance process? I think it's worth pondering, because I don't think it has been much discussed at all with respect to this whole issue.
Right. So thank you for the question. It's interesting. I just wrote an article, and for your audience, you can look at this virtual panel that we had last week, where we discussed the Houthi narratives in depth. You can find this on Twitter. And this was one of the points that I tried to make, that, similar to Iran, the Houthis have developed a narrative based on revolution, based on dissent, right? So for them, this is an ongoing revolution. And just like Iran has entered over 4 decades of revolution, of the status of revolution, right? The Houthis could sustain this image, this status, this narrative of revolution, as revolutionaries, as defenders against imperialism, against occupation, against foreign intervention, they can sustain this as long as they want because they can always find an enemy, right? They can still make peace with Saudi Arabia. But as we've seen over the last 3 weeks, now that they engaged Saudi Arabia in talks to make a deal, a peace deal with them, they stopped talking about Saudi Arabia as the aggressor, as the occupier, as the evil, entity. And then they just shifted back to their traditional slogan of talking about, Israel, the Zionist entity, and the U.S., right? Where this is their slogan, this is their written slogan against the U.S. and Israel. So again, this shows a similar narrative, a similar tactic to Iran, right? When, for the last 4 years, it was aggression against Saudi Arabia, against the Gulf countries, etc. But then all of a sudden, there's a rapprochement for the past 18 months or a little bit longer, and the rhetoric cools off. As relations warm, they stop attacking Saudi Arabia, and now that they're about to open a consulate again, their diplomatic mission, we've seen how they've toned down their rhetoric against Saudi Arabia. It's almost similar to what the Houthis are doing and how they do it. To your question about, is there a cohesive leadership? There is in the background. The image that we have, the optics, the outside, for the outsiders, this image of a, they call it reconciliation government between the Houthi movement and the former ruling party in Sanaa, in the creation of this supreme political council, right? With the president, members, and then the cabinet under that council. That is the image that they give us in the outside, for the media, for the public consumption. Behind the scenes, the president of this Supreme Council is the brother-in-law of the leader of the Houthi movement, right? So we begin to see the connection. The main, the public face of this Supreme Political Council, Mohammed Ali al-Houthi, who we see on social media, who we see in mainstream media outlets, he is a cousin of the leader, Abdul Malik al-Houthi. The Minister of Interior is the uncle of Abdul Malik al-Houthi. His name is Abdul Karim Amir al-Din al-Houthi. I've written about this in the past, and some of us observers that we dig deep into the politics and the nature of the Houthi movement, some of us see Abdul Karim Amir al-Din al-Houthi, the uncle, as the main person. He's the new patriarch. He is basically the man that, his position reflects what he does in the background. He's the Minister of Interior, but he handles the economy. He handles the relations with the international organizations like the UN. He also is the center for the patronage network. He's a very interesting person that we don't see in public very much. We don't see his meetings being broadcasted by Houthi media. We don't see him in social media. He's always in the background, but we always know who is linked to him, like Abu Ali al-Hakam. He is the head of intelligence for the military and the Ministry of Defense. He is under the minister. He should be under the Ministry of Defense, but he's actually under the Minister of Interior. And this is where we see the security structure then, all the way to the pyramid. We also see a couple of brothers of Abdul Malik al-Houthi who are ministers or deputy ministers, education. So we see that the family itself, Beit al-Houthi, the Houthi family, are the ones that are over the umbrella. They are the ones that control the movement, control the narrative, control the patronage networks that extend down to to local tribes and villages. And they are the ones who attract the loyalty of everyone in the patronage network, whether you're civilian, the tribesman, or in the military. Your loyalty extends all the way up to Abdul Karim al-Houthi and Abdul Malik al-Houthi. They are the ones that, put together this structure. The way that I've put together what their goal is, I've criticized the Houthis a bit because I don't believe that they know how to govern. They're not at that point. And this is one of the main reasons why they co-opted the former ruling party. Since the start of the war, they partnered with the leaders of the former ruling party in order to take over the government institutions. These were the members of the former ruling party were the ones that knew how to govern. They were the bureaucrats, and they knew how to do things. They knew how to run institutions. Since then, over the last 8 years, the Houthis obviously learned how to do this, and they started positioning supervisors, a shadow bureaucratic core within every government institution. And today, this is who governs every government institution, every ministry, every school, every police department, every military unit. This is the core that they've created. And then they use, enlisted or appointed military officers with experience to actually run the military and the units. And then, the bureaucrats who are willing to be loyal to the family to administer the actual government institutions. What I believe, and I've said for a while, is that the Houthi don't want to rule Yemen. They want to be behind the government. They want to be the puppet masters. And this goes back to what I mentioned earlier, that they still don't know. Should we have an imamate? Should we have a government like Iran? Yemen is very different to Iran. It has many political parties. It was before the Arab Spring, it was praised as the Arab country with the most political diversity, right? Someone was just tweeting that before 2011, before 2014, let's say, before the start of the conflict, Yemen had over 200 newspapers. It was always regarded as being one of the more pluralist Arab countries, right? With more freedom of press. It was oppressed by the government. There was a lot of political movement, whether it was Al-Ayam in Aden or other political newspapers, partisan newspapers. But there were over 200 newspapers. And today, because of the Houthis in particular, that number is in the dozens today. And so we can clearly see the impact of the heavy-handed approach by the Houthis, similar to that we see in Iran. Where could it go? Many of us don't see the Houthis being able to govern with a coalition government, because that would be giving their rivals too much space, too much of a voice. So some of us believe that the Houthi, Abdul Karim al-Houthi, Abdul Malik al-Houthi, would want to be behind that government. It doesn't have to be Mahdi Mashhad, who becomes the next president of the republic, legitimate president of the republic, but it could be somebody that they appoint that is loyal to the family and can rule Yemen for 5 years, 10 years, or decades to come.
How would that be in any way acceptable to the existing factions, especially the ones that are most hardline opposed to the Houthi movements? And we can discuss who that is in particular, because there's a fair amount of difference even within the current coalition.
Right. When we look across all the political rivals for the Houthis, nobody would accept the Houthis ruling Yemen for one more year. I mean, this is the dilemma at the moment, where the coalition led by Saudi Arabia wants to push for a deal that would legitimize, that would justify the Houthi ruling from Sanaa, from the capital of the Republic of Yemen. Whether it's Islam, the Sunni Muslim Brotherhood affiliate in Yemen, which is an umbrella organization of businessmen, tribes, and the Muslim Brotherhood, Salafi elements as well.
Mm-hmm.
or the members of the factions of the former ruling party, the General People's Congress, the GPC, or the Southerners. Today, this week, as we speak on Tuesday, it's almost going to be about 4 or 5 days since the Southerners engaged a comprehensive South-South dialogue to create a united front, right, in order to advance their ambitions, to advance their interests, and to start working on the challenges, specifically the economy and security. The Southerners are definitely not willing to accept a religious extremist group ruling from Sanaa once again, right? They've worked throughout this conflict to marginalize the Muslim Brotherhood, marginalize al-Islah within the 8 provinces in the south, to remove them from power. We see this in Aden, we saw it in Shabwa, we're now seeing it in Hadramaut, we saw it in Socotra. And, the Southerners can't say, well, we got rid of Islah, we marginalized Islah, we're not going to welcome the, Houthis from an extremist point of view. And so it's going to be very difficult to do that, where the Southerners could entrench their approach and simply draw a de facto border with the North. And if the coalition and the international community is not able to find a solution, a way forward, which minimizes the Houthi influence and the Houthi power, the military power of the Houthis today, that can no longer threaten the South with an invasion. We see over the last couple of weeks, the Houthis have escalated their threats against the southern provinces and against the southern actors, threatening more drone and missile strikes on oil facilities, which are primarily in the south. And so the Southerners don't see any good faith on the part of the Houthis to respect the southern issue, their ambitions, and the Southerners remain seeing the Houthis as an existential threat.
I'm a little mystified by the Saudi role and position on all of this, because there seem to be several mutually contradictory and inconsistent elements in the way they are approaching this framework. Saudi Arabia, the Arab coalition, came into the war as a result of a request by the displaced Yemeni government. The whole point was that they first were trying to put down the rebellion by the Houthis, the uprising, and second, they regarded the Houthis, rightly so, as a danger to their own borders. Now, Houthis allegedly put aside immediate attacks on the Saudi infrastructure, but they have not given up their weapons. There hasn't been a massive de-armament movement. And while Iran claimed that they will curb their support, we don't really see. We've seen multiple shipments of weapons being intercepted since that announcement, and those weapons are going somewhere. So on the one hand, you have the immediate security threat to Saudi own security. On the other hand, you have the Yemen government, which is at the very least at odds with the Houthis, and before the Yemen government can settle the difference, Saudi is trying to force that reality on Yemen after all the money they expended to do exactly the opposite. Just does not make any sense. So what is really going on here? Because I am failing to see the logic here.
Definitely complicated. I always remind observers that a Houthi-Saudi peace agreement does not equal peace in Yemen. This agreement is, you can't blame Saudi Arabia, but this agreement or this efforts are primarily to protect Saudi interests. As you mentioned, it's been over a year since April 1st, 2022, the Saudi Arabia-led coalition has not had any airstrikes on Houthi-held territorial positions. That's over a year now. At the same time, the Houthis have stopped drone strikes and missile strikes across into Abha, Najran, Jazan, Jeddah, and Aramco facilities. So this has been in the interest of Saudi Arabia by the king, by the crown prince, in order to stabilize Saudi Arabia in order to advance Saudi economic and security interests, for sure. But in the same time, we have seen the Houthis escalate since April 2022, against their Yemeni rivals on the ground, whether it's in Al Jauf, Marib, Shabwa, Al Baida, Taiz, Lahaj, Adala, Hodeidah, right? So the Houthis are maintaining a détente with Saudi Arabia in order to extract as many benefits as they can from negotiations with Saudi Arabia, but at the same time, they maintain the pressure on the Yemeni rivals. So again, this goes back to what the Southerners say, that they can't trust the Houthis because the Houthis are supposed to have agreed to a ceasefire on April 1st. Then that meant no movement, no strikes, no attacks inside Yemen, as well as across the border against Saudi Arabia or the UAE. So for over a year, the Southerners have been attacked in Adala, in Shabwa, in Abiyan, right, in Lahaj. And this just, fuels the Southern perspective that Houthis are not truly committed to peace. Second, the Houthis have spent 8 years surrounding the city of Taiz, stranglehold, with a stronghold, chokehold on the city of Taiz, controlling all the roads in and out of the city. People are dying, trying to go from Lahaj into the city, from the west side of the province of Taiz into the city to take, commercial goods, or merely traveling themselves to visit families or to leave Taiz altogether. Every week we see car accidents, resulting from new dangerous roads where people and merchants are trying to bypass the Houthi checkpoints, which extort tremendous amounts of money from everyone that tries to go in or out of Taiz. So definitely the Houthis have not shown any good faith toward, making peace with their Yemeni rivals. Saudi Arabia would like, if we look at the talks early in April in Sanaa, the Saudis managed to be greeted by the Houthis through their ambassador, Mohammed Al-Jaber, who visited Sanaa for about 5 days, through mediation from Oman, and begin a face-to-face talk, right? No longer just in Muscat, but making presence felt in Sanaa, reaching out, crossing that line to shake hands and listen to each other informally as well. But we saw how that deteriorated into another war of words, because the ambassador Mohammed Al-Jaber proposed that Saudi Arabia could play as a mediator between the Houthis and the Yemeni rivals, mainly the legitimate government, the political leadership council, right? And this was instantly rejected by Saudi leadership, by the Houthi leadership, all the way from Abdul Malik to Muhammad Ali al-Houthi, to every major voice in the Houthi government to reject that role. It's not so much that the Houthis love the UN role as a mediator, as a peacekeeper, it's just their focus was to reject the role of Saudi Arabia as a mediator, simply because, the Houthis believe that they need, again, it goes back to them wanting to rule for a long time. The Houthis know that they have to make peace with Saudi Arabia if they want to rule Sanaa for a long period. They cannot rule Sanaa without having a peace deal, making peace with Saudi Arabia. This, in the traditional sense, since 1967, comes with financial benefits from Saudi Arabia to the Sanaa government. So since 1967, Saudi Arabia has supported Yemen Central Bank, has supported the deficit, has covered the deficit, which often reached $2-3 billion a year, supported the military. There was a big expose in the year 2012 after the Arab Spring, where a newspaper published the names and the amounts received by all political figures and tribal sheikhs in Yemen from Saudi Arabia for decades. So today, you can imagine Houthis want a cut of that. They want their share of the pie, and the biggest pie is Saudi Arabia. So, they want Saudi Arabia to pay the salaries of all their employees in their territory, not so much because they care about the employees themselves, but because the Houthis would take a share of that money going into the salaries. Today, we see that. We hear from international organizations working, whether it's in Taiz, in Sanaa, in Hodeidah, where their employees, their Yemeni employees, whether it's a security guard or somebody working for an NGO, will make $150, $500, $1,000 a month. The Houthis take a percentage of that salary every month, that is paid by an international organization. Back in 2019, people from some staff members from an international organization working in Taiz, they told me how from one day to the next, the Houthi security authorities demanded that every organization working in Taiz needed to increase their security personnel by 50% almost, right? So if they had 10 guards, they had to hire another 3 to 5 guards. This was for patronage purposes. And obviously, you have more spies in those, you have more loyalists spying on these agencies and reporting back to the Houthis on what the foreigners were doing, what the communication between the foreigners and the Yemenis, their movement, where they were going, etc. So it's a very complicated system that the Houthis have developed to keep an eye on international organizations and foreigners in particular. We see how the Houthis, they want to get more legitimacy from Saudi Arabia because this cements them as rulers in Sana'a. And they want the economic and financial benefits that come from that relationship. So they are against Saudi Arabia playing a role as mediator with other rivals, because then they think that the other rivals are going to get a share of that pie, and they don't want. The Houthis want to receive 100 million and then say who they're going to give this money to. Not for Saudi Arabia to say, here's 100 million, you get 50, they get 50. No, the Houthis want to dictate who gets money, who gets jobs, who gets a salary, depending on their priorities. This is also why the U.S. administration, the Biden administration, has echoed fears from the political leadership council when it comes to a Saudi proposal to allow Yemeni oil revenue to pay salaries for people under the Houthi government. The U.S. has expressed opposition to this proposal, mainly because they're aware that this money will go to fund the jihad, to fund the military activities against their Yemeni political rivals. It would strengthen the Yemeni, the Houthi government, and obviously it would make money and profits for the Houthi leadership. So the U.S. and supports the legitimate government in rejecting this plan, this demand from the Houthis.
I mean, all of this seems to breed nothing but distrust between the Yemen government and the Saudis, who, on the one hand, spent all this time fighting the Houthis precisely because they did not trust them to keep their words with or without Iran, and on the other hand, are now putting their entire trust into Houthis, even as Houthis are announcing it, that regardless of what happens with the Saudis, the rest of Yemen is fair game for atrocities. And by the way, not just Yemen, external maritime trade disruptions are not possible. They've in the past threatened Bahrain and even Israel. So we see that these people have military capabilities, and they could use them in a wide variety of ways. And by the way, once they receive whatever financial commitments from Saudis, they can start attacking them again.
That's the main concern, and you hit the nail on the head right there. And I've said it plenty of times, and Yemenis say it to me all the time. Prior to this conflict, there was a rational relationship between Saudi Arabia and the government in Sana'a. Saudis knew that the former president liked to use different tactics in order to extract financial and economic benefits from Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia knew that logically this would happen and this was needed, but Saudi had, issues linked to these economic and financial benefits. So if we look back at the year 2000, Ali Abdullah Saleh was getting a little bit too cozy with the West, right? The development of democracy, pluralism. Sanaa was the host of the first summit of the democracies. I believe it was 1998 or 1999. I forget this. But they hosted the first summit of democracies. This was huge. This was the only country in the Arabian Peninsula that wasn't a monarchy, that was moving toward democracy, that valued pluralism, whether it was co-opted or not. But you had multiple political parties, right? Which is not the case across the Gulf region for one. And so, but the relationship was rational, right? Saudi knew that Yemen needed economic assistance. Saudi covered in the early 2000s until 2011. Again, the deficit was between 2 billion and 3 billion. Saudi Arabia was able to cover that through assistance. We saw just think about this. In 2011, the UN asked for $250 million for aid for Yemen. This year, in March of this year, the UN asked for $4.3 billion for aid for Yemen. You just see the numbers as the consequence of this conflict, right? Where the economic crisis back in 2010 was manageable. The former prime minister, the late Dr. Abdel Karim El-Eriani, warned the international community in 2009 that Yemen would face a deep economic crisis if the root causes of economic stress were not addressed. This was back in 2009. So in 2010, the international community, mainly in the GCC, were contributing to alleviating some of these economic problems, right? But it was in the between 2 billion and 3 billion, right? Today, Yemen needs more than $1 billion for the central bank in order to sustain the foreign currency, right? The foreign currency exchange to sustain the real. But then the UN is saying that Yemen needs more than $4.3 billion a year for the humanitarian response. So it's beyond an economic crisis. This is, almost zero economy in Yemen in real terms. Yes, there are commercial goods at the stores, in the souks, there are transactions, but there's inflation, there are salaries that are not paid, poverty is increasing, famine is increasing across the northern areas, which are controlled by the Houthis. So Houthis want to extract more and more financial benefits from Saudi Arabia, which is the primary donor to Yemen's economy. But Saudi Arabia has a limit, they cannot be spending all this money. And yes, you brought up the point of hundreds of billions of dollars having been spent over the last 8 years on military, for the military. But we also have to be realistic here. It's not all spent just for the war in Yemen. Saudi Arabia has, inherent security interest for their own territory, not just because of the Houthi threat, but because of the region as a whole and domestically. So these hundreds of billions of dollars since Obama administration and the Trump administration have not been just a waste in the Yemen conflict. A lot of that money has been spent arming the Houthi rival forces, whether it's the National Army or in the case of the Southern Forces, right? But that is a natural consequence of the conflict itself.
Now, before I get to my next point, which is about Iran's role in this whole current scenario, from the perspective of Western governments, after years of mutual lobbying by all sides against each other, name calling, Saudis are, is launching airstrikes against civilians. Houthis are doing anything which they were in fact doing. The Houthis were, engaged in all sorts of atrocities. All of a sudden, the rhetoric has calmed down. Everyone is good friends again, or at least trying to negotiate some sort of arrangement. For future reference and in broader geopolitical context of the Middle East, how seriously should Western policymakers take inter-Arab disputes, given the fact that despite any real human rights and security legitimacy of claims, at some point there's a very good chance that somebody may, who may be our ally or maybe somebody we have our differences is, but comes to power and decides to put an end to that particular dispute on their own terms, and all of a sudden the villains we're supposed to be sanctioning and name calling and pressuring have become part of the solution instead of part of the problem, at least from the perspective of those actors, and perhaps not from the perspectives of the US and others. How can how should we be handling these information wars, given that the outcome today is basically mind-boggling and a complete 180 from what we were hearing, a little over a year ago?
We have to be realistic too, right? Any peace between Iran, any peace between hostile parties should be welcome, right?
Mhm.
Everybody should agree that stability in the Middle East should be a priority. The end of conflict should come soon, not just for the political elites, but for the people of the Middle East, right? I mean, look at Iran and the population there. They're tired of living in this revolutionary status and being threatened and being oppressed, right? But then at the same time, in Saudi Arabia, we see that Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman really wants to engage this futuristic, economic plan and wants stability, etc., for the benefit of the state and for the benefit of the people of Saudi Arabia. For prosperity, needs security, whether it's from the southern flank or from the east, from Iran, right? They don't want this nuclear threat hanging over their heads as they're investing hundreds of billions of dollars in the economy, right? So any peace between these parties should be welcome. Again, how that peace is structured, right? And how committed the political elites on both sides are to this peace deal, that's what we don't know. That's what's hanging over our heads. We're speculating. Well, that today the government of Risi and the government of the Ayatollahs in Tehran and the Revolutionary Guard are going to be vested in this peace agreement, and they're going to end all hostilities, and they're going to, raise the confidence between the two of them and work toward a sustainable peace, right? Beyond this sectarian rhetoric, just as states and as people. With Yemen, as I mentioned, it's going to be complicated because in Yemen you have the need for peace between neighbors, so between Yemeni parties like the Houthis and the Southerners, the Muslim Brotherhood, the GPC, peace, and then peace with the neighbor, with Saudi Arabia, with Oman, even with the UAE, right? With parties that they share the borders with and parties that they don't share borders with. This is the difficult part. And always talk about what comes first, the chicken or the egg. Should the Houthis make peace with Saudi Arabia first and then make peace with their rivals? Or should Houthis and Yemeni rivals make peace, create a stable government built on stability, and then that by default brings stability with the neighbors, right? An agreement of non-aggression with Saudi Arabia, Oman, the UAE, the whole GCC, right? We're also neglecting to a degree the Horn of Africa, but that's for another day because there are tensions that remain there. So it is something that we need more information on, or we need more evidence of real commitment, and that is not just rhetoric, right? So again, with regard to Iran and Saudi Arabia, the mainstream media, the headlines were this great breakthrough in Beijing, thanks to the Chinese government. In reality, we know that for the last 18 months, almost 2 years, Iran and Saudi Arabia have been talking in Baghdad. That's where they first started talking, in Iraq. Thanks to the Iraqis, they were able to set up a meeting, and they were able to set up talks. And in those talks, both Iran and Saudi Arabia admitted that they talked about Yemen, they talked about Syria, they talked about Lebanon, right? So we know that all of those issues were discussed in Baghdad. And yes, there's been talk after Baghdad, there were talks in Muscat, and yes, there were talks with thanks to the Chinese. But we have to see the whole trajectory of that dialogue, which also gives us a positive outlook, right? If they've been able to talk to each other for over a year and a half, they should be able to talk to each other for another year and a half, right? So we could see that slowly that peace could come, the rhetoric could go away, and we can expect more stability. One of the main issues that comes as we look at Iran-Saudi talks is, the role of the approach to the Houthis as an Iranian proxy, right? We again, by the Houthis are not helping against this image, because they adopt the same Iranian style narratives. They rely heavily on Iran for weapons. I was in the UN panel when we first wrote. The team that I was a part of was the first to write in the clear evidence that Houthis were using missiles supplied by Iran. I mean, we documented the Iranian components in both missiles, long-range missiles that went over 1,000 kilometers, to drones that were being used. And even today, we see many of the drones that are being supplied by Iran to Russia and Ukraine, they have been used in Yemen for over 3 or 4 years. This isn't news. There's clear evidence. In 2019, I believe it was December 2019, I was not on the panel anymore, but that's when the Houthis and the Iranians officially signed a defense pact. In public, we already knew that this existed, but they made it public with the Houthi ambassador in Tehran. And so the UN panel has documented the relationship between the Houthis and the Revolutionary Guard, whether it's economically or militarily. As you mentioned in the intro, the number of shipments that have been seized in Yemen, in Mahra in particular, or by the navies from Australia, Britain, the US, the French, in the Gulf of Oman, in the Arabian Sea, and in the Red Sea. Clear markings of Iranian role, not just because the crew of these vessels was Iranian, but because these weapons had clear Iranian origins. The GPS systems on these boats point to specific ports in Iran as their point of origin for those cargoes. So it is very, the relationship between Iran and the Houthis, from an Iranian perspective, it's an on and off switch, right? When tensions are high, they turn the switch on. The Houthis start threatening their neighbors. There's an escalation. When relationships become a bit friendlier, when there's a rapprochement like today, the Iranians turn the switch off, and then all of a sudden the rhetoric tones down. We see the drugs being transported. Drugs going through Yemen. There's a history of smugglers transporting drugs through Yemeni territory to the Gulf countries, Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, all the way up to Bahrain. But there's also that business in the Horn of Africa, and this is why I mentioned it earlier. A lot of the light weapons, a lot of headlines point to thousands and thousands of weapons going from Iran into Yemen. The Houthis don't need AK-47s. They got plenty, but it's a good business in Africa, beginning in the Horn of Africa. So we can see how Houthi smugglers are profiting, from the relationship with Iran through clients in the Horn of Africa. Houthis need rocket-propelled grenade. They need rocket systems. They need RPGs. They need missile systems. They need drone components, missile components. They need computer components. This is the kind of stuff that the Houthis are smuggling into their territory for their benefit. The rest, it has to be clearly for business purposes, or in the war economy. From the Houthi perspective, the relationship with Iran, I mean, this is international legitimacy. The relationship with Tehran primarily is there as the foundation for the Houthi legitimacy, right? The alliance with Hezbollah in Lebanon. Hezbollah is a legal political party in Lebanon. It adds to the relationship, to the legitimacy of the Houthis. The relationship with Syria, with Damascus, the history of relations between Zaidi, personalities like the Houthi family is decades old. And there are good connections in Damascus with the Houthis. With the Shia areas in Iraq, there's a strong relationship between Iraqi Shia and the Houthis going back more than a couple of decades. So the Houthis use this network that is supported by Iran to strengthen their own position, to strengthen their own technology and capacity, both in the government level and in the military sphere. It is a mutually beneficial relationship. A lot of experts, even in our virtual panel where we discussed the Houthi narratives, a couple of the panelists said that we cannot see the Houthis as a proxy, but as an ally of Iran that receives benefits. The Houthis go out of their way, from Abdul Malik all the way down to governors, Houthi governors, to emphasize the sovereignty of the government in Sanaa, that they don't follow the orders of Iran, and they are not controlled by Iran. But there is plenty of evidence to show how that relationship, that reciprocal relationship, fits both of their interests. And to be honest, if it was not for Iran, the Houthis could not sustain military superiority on the ground. If it was not for Iran, they would not have the capability to strike Jeddah or Aramco in Riyadh or in the east areas. There is a clear evidence to show how the Houthis expanded and gained control and gained territory thanks to these weapons, which gave them superiority on the battlefield within Yemen. And definitely without an air force, they've been able to hit back at Saudi Arabia and the UAE for 8 years. A lot of people just want to focus on the missile strike in Riyadh in November 2017, but they forget that before that, the Houthis were launching missiles that were less effective in 2016 and early 2017. And all of this thanks to the military assistance provided by Iran.
That brings me to the next point, because throughout the war, the Saudis treated Houthis very much like a proxy of Iran, and in light of the integrated network of assorted Middle Eastern entities that Iran has built, this is it clearly viewed Houthis as part of its geopolitical trajectory. Now, all of a sudden, Iran seems to be out of the negotiation picture. It is not facilitating a breakthrough in diplomatic tensions between the Saudis and the Houthis, or for that matter, the Houthis and the Yemen government, while claiming that they're not, that they've curbed support and essentially indicating or messaging that they are all for peace and so on and so forth. What is the real role of Iran in this scenario? Why is it not being more helpful? Because it clearly could.
We need to pay attention to what actually happening, not just what the media reports. When the talks concluded in Sanaa and the Saudi ambassador Mohammed al-Jaber left Sanaa for Saudi Arabia, the Houthi spokesman Mohammed Abdul Salam flew with the Omani delegation back to Muscat. Within a week, he was meeting with Iranian officials in public. So he met the foreign minister just about a week or a week and a half ago in there. And, this shows the intimacy, the relationship, right? The close relations that, you know, the Houthis have with Iran. I mean, the next step would have just been for Mohammed Abdul Salam to have gone to Tehran and had meetings with the president and the foreign minister. But when it comes to optics, is as equally important, and the implications are just as equal. You know, with Mohammed Abdul Salam meeting the foreign minister in Muscat, very symbolic. The optics were there. You know, there was solid message there. And this continues to give Iran a role. Iran needs this role because it is a card that they play with Saudi Arabia, right? Yes, we can influence. As Saudi and Iran build rapport, build their peace, the Iranians are like, yes, we're going to work hard on the Houthis, and we're going to talk to our brothers, the Houthis, and everything in order to move forward and everything. So then they meet, and we did not see any statements from Iran condemning the aggressive narrative from the Houthis after the meetings with Al-Jabr, right? Where the Houthis, 2 days before Al-Jabr left Sanaa, the Houthi officials returned to the aggressive rhetoric attacking Saudi Arabia, right? Threatening Saudi Arabia. The Houthi Minister of Defense made a video directly threatening Saudi Arabia if Saudi failed to fulfill the demands made by Sanaa, right? The Iranians never said anything about that, never made a comment about that, have not made a comment about playing a role in mediating this, even though 2 UN envoys have visited Tehran. Martin Griffith and the current Hans Grundenberg have visited Tehran. They were the first, Martin Griffith was the first UN envoy to visit Tehran, February 2021. And Hans Grundenberg visited Tehran after the Beijing talks between Saudi and Iran. And so we don't see Iran reaching out to Yemeni political factions that are against the Houthis. We don't see them asking for meetings. We don't see them moving around and reaching out. It's only meeting with the Houthis. So there is, you know, there is a relationship there that is beneficial to both. Iran can use the Houthis to pressure Saudi Arabia on their interest, and at the same time, Houthis can use Iran to pressure Saudi Arabia to their interest. This is the triangle that in the relationship that we see. And for 8 years, we've seen Saudi Arabia mismanage, you know, been poorly handled these relationships, these 2 relationships, which have prolonged the conflict itself, right? In that mismanagement of those relationships has not helped the peace and stability in Saudi Arabia, and it's definitely hurt, prolonged and escalated the conflict in Yemen, within Yemen territory itself.
Well, what we do know, and that many people forget, is that this break with the relations with Iran is not ancient. It only dates back to 2016. Before that, Saudi and Iran had diplomatic relations, which did not stop Iran from trying to assassinate the Saudi ambassador in 2011 on US soil, and they had asserted other problems besides that. So all of a sudden, everybody expects a miraculous financial regrouping and reparation of relations to a level that never really existed, at least not with the Islamic Republic. So why is there this sudden hope for something that never was?
Unfortunately, yes. Some observers are, you know, too optimistic, too quick to jump to conclusions. And as you mentioned, they're praising these talks in Beijing as if, you know, there had never been peace between, you know, Saudi Arabia and Iran to a relative level, right? We know that the Arab Spring created conflict. It opened up a vacuum for further conflict. It affected relationships. different political parties, different political elites, different governments in the region saw an opportunity to advance their interest, right? And so, you know, I was in Yemen. I was in Yemen during the 6-year wars between the Houthis and the regime in Sanaa, the Ali Abdullah Saleh's regime in Sanaa, from 2004 to 2010. And I was actually doing research, and I met a lot of I was looking when I was doing research, I was looking at the origins of the military in Sanaa, and how in 1962, and how the military had been the pillar for the state, and it had been the base for state building since 1967, right? And I met a lot of the military men that had been involved in the revolution in 1962, as well as, you know, governments before Ali Abdullah Saleh, who took power in 1978. But I was hearing about what was going on in Sada and in other parts during the war with the Houthis. And at the same time, while I was in Sanaa, people should remember that President Khatami visited Sanaa. I believe it was 2002, 2001 or 2002 that he visited Sanaa with President Ali Abdullah Saleh. And from people close to Ali Abdullah Saleh that I knew, you know, they mentioned that Ali Abdullah Saleh was very straight with the Iranians and asked them not to interfere in the war with the Houthis. Soon after Khatami visited Sanaa between 2004 and 2009, Ali Abdullah Saleh cracked down on a lot of the Iranian organizations in Sanaa. There used to be clinics, there used to be small hospitals present in Sanaa that were shut down because the investigations revealed that these clinics were funneling money to the Houthis in Sada. And so, you know, this again renewed the tensions between Ali Abdullah Saleh and Iran. And keep in mind also that in the 1980s, when Ali Abdullah Saleh was president, Ali Abdullah Saleh was allied with Saddam Hussein in the Iran-Iraq war. So those tensions go further back. If we go farther than this, you know, multiple Zaidi imams in Sanaa rejected Iranian Shia 12er presence in Sanaa. There's well-documented evidence of Iranian 12er Shia trying to preach in the old city, in the old mosque in Sanaa, and the imam rejected and expelled that particular individual. And so, you know, Zaidi Islam for centuries had rejected Shiism in the Iranian form. And what you know, Zaidis had been praised among in intellectual Sunni circles as being a highly developed theology, because in the late 1700s, early 1800s, the Sheikh al-Islam, for the Zaidi Imam, incorporated the Sunni madhab into Zaidi theology. You know, so when it comes to jurisprudence, still to date, a lot of Sunni scholars quote Zaidi clerics in their fiqh, in their theology discussions. You know, that's how important Zaidi academics, Zaidi theology and jurisprudence had been in the Islamic world for centuries. And so now, you know, with the Houthis, we see the distance, the gap between Beit al-Houthi, the Houthi family, and Zaidi Islam. To go further, and I apologize if I get too academic here, but to details, you know, Zaidi Islam is founded, its foundation is on the imamate. The Zaidi Islam depends on the presence of the imam. And there are 14 qualities since over 1,000 years ago. There are 14 qualities that a Zaidi imam must meet in order to claim to be imam and in order to be accepted as imam. Yeah, there are 14. He must be mushtahid, he must be mujahid, he must be a poet, he must be, you know, be a learned man in jurisprudence and fiqh, you know, he must be a warrior. In all of this, is within the 14 qualities of the imam. It's been rare when an imam has, fulfilled all 14 qualities, but most of them have come pretty close, right? In a controversy rose when Imam Yahya Hamid ad-Din claimed to be the successor to his father in 1904. And Imam Yahya Hamid ad-Din was well known for his jurisprudence. He was a poet. He was a learned individual. He knew the world. He read international newspapers, and so he was respected. But it came to a clause. It came to a clause where the tribesmen or the other Hashemi families that wanted to challenge him said that he was not a commander, a military commander. And this is when a tribal sheikh came in and put his face, put his word, put his honor before the tribal and religious elite, and pledged his loyalty to Imam Yahya and made him a complete imam. Today, Abdul Malik al-Houthi would fail most of those 14 qualities because he's known not to be a learned man in jurisprudence. When his brother Hussein al-Houthi died, when he was killed by the Yemeni military, there was a lot of conflict within the family and the movement for succession. Because Abdul Malik al-Houthi was not the first choice. He was very criticized, but his father was the patriarch, so his father was able to push through. But a lot of people again believe that his uncle Abdul Karim Amir al-Houthi is the more qualified individual religiously and within those 14 qualities. It is very different than the Iranian model. It is with Wilayat al-Faqih. And we know that since the 1980s, the Zaidi clerics tried to create a system led by the clerics, not so much an imam, because they knew that not only was the Yemeni government opposed to the rise of an imamate, but the modern world would not accept a traditional imam. So, few clerics from that later on became part of the Houthi movement. In the 1980s, they formed the group of the Believing Youth. All of this was to revive Zaidi, but Zaidi Islam, but to revive it academically, theologically, in jurisprudence. So all the Hashemi students would learn more about Zaidi theology on top of their ordinary schoolwork. So we saw that since the late 1980s, the Zaidi cleric elite, the ulama, really had a plan to strengthen the role of the ulama, of the clerics in Zaidi Islam, in the absence of the rightly appointed imam. This is a threat to someone like the leaders of the Houthi family, because they would like to be imams, and they would want the role of the clerics to be minimal, just as advisors in shura, right, as a consultative council, not the rulers of the system, as we see in Iran. So all of this is a little bit complicated, and we don't really know where the Houthis and their supporters, many of whom are not even Zaidis, many of their supporters are not Zaidis, but they support this resistance because they want to rise up within the elite. They want to climb the ladder. They want to be part of the government. They couldn't be part of the Hadi's government. They couldn't be part of Ali Abdullah's government. They saw the opportunity within the Houthi movement to be part of a government, and they've taken that opportunity.
So we are seeing that Iran has created this network, but not every part of it is an easy fit to Iran's model, and some proxies are more similar to Iran's own system than others, and others have internal inconsistencies. We have the Houthis, we have Hezbollah, we have Assad. That's he's a dictator, but it's a completely different type of a system than the Houthis, for instance. And we are seeing this framework now Iran is benefiting from these normalization processes. It is benefiting politically. It is regaining regional legitimacy. It is gaining source of funding for its operations, gaining access to information and to international stages. Whereas its counterparts are, making some money and maybe getting some temporary stability of questionable duration. So let's talk about this regional security framework in light of these processes and how Saudi move in those towards Iran and towards Assad and towards all these groups, catalyzing this security reconsideration. I mean, some parts of this process seem more logical than others. Iran, understandable. Assad, at least for financial reasons, it's understandable, although morally it is not. Why Saudi is bringing back Hamas just as the Iranians and Assad are kind of reconsolidating behind them after years of kind of hit and miss here and there. Why would they want to strengthen these organizations? That's not as clear to me as some of the more obvious recent moves.
I mean, it's time and an opportunity, right? Saudi Arabia, again, is a government that wants to develop stability for themselves. They know that they have to play with other actors. They have to have relationships with other actors. So yes, well, before, they didn't see eye to eye with Hamas. Now they're welcoming them. They're going to Mecca for Umrah, and then they're coming to meet with Saudi officials. At the same time, while Israel is trying to convince Saudi to join the Abrahamic Accords, right?
Very
with
unlikely.
UAE.
I am one of the biggest skeptics of the recent news that's proliferating mostly from Israeli sources and also from some very low level Saudi sources that have nothing to do with the decision makers.
Right. But it just fits on how, Saudi would, Netanyahu is back in power, right? So now his rhetoric is against Iran. He wants war with Iran. He wants to stop Iran. And here is Saudi Arabia, who has opposed the JCPOA since Obama administration, right? Since the beginning of it. But now they're like, well, maybe we need some sort of JCPOA, but we don't like this form, right? Because now they are warming up to Iran, right? Now Saudi Arabia wants nuclear technology for energy, etc. So it is this cycle where Saudi reaches out to Iran, who has a conflict with Israel. Israel's reaching out to Saudi Arabia in order to keep Saudi Arabia away from Iran, because if Israel loses Saudi Arabia, it's on its own against Iran, right? It has no other ally against Iran in the region. At the same time, we see Saudi Arabia taking opportunity of the war in Ukraine and gravitating toward Russia, right? Gravitating toward China, merely because the winds of change in the U.S. went from Donald Trump, who was very friendly to the Saudis and selling them whatever weapons they wanted, to Biden opposing Mohammed bin Salman.
I'm not sure that I agree with that, because Trump did not actually. First of all, Trump did not really defend Saudi during the Aramco attack in September, so that's certainly. But the other issue, Saudi has been gravitating to China for a while. It hasn't been reported widely, and certainly not by U.S. media, but just because of the more recent dramatic visible political step, that doesn't mean that they have not been developing parallel institutions. And of course, within Saudi, we see different, more pro-Western factions like Mohammed bin Salman, and more China-oriented factions by like some of the people in the foreign ministry. So
no, I mean, even to your point about Trump, Trump was selling them whatever weapons they wanted, but then he's the one that allowed the sanctions against Iran to expire. So, I mean, you can see Trump's approach where conflict is good for business. Why should I renew the sanctions against Iran when Saudi Arabia can come in and buy more from us, right? And you're right about the response, the failure for the U.S. to respond to the Aramco strikes by Houthis, and then from Iraq, right? Remember that the Houthis took credit for that strike, but then the evidence pointed to Iraqi militia having conducted that strike close to Riyadh. About China, you know, I've said it a lot of times, and I've been called crazy, but you know, with progressives here in the U.S., when they say, you know, the war in Yemen will end if the U.S. Withdraws support for Saudi Arabia and it stops selling them weapons. And I said, you know, Saudi Arabia could just abandon 100 U.S. fighter jets and leave them in a warehouse because they have the money to buy 100 Chinese armed drones to use in Yemen. And there's no pilot, and there's no, if the drone gets shut down, oops, let's buy another one. There's no pilot to have to negotiate as a POW to release like they did in last month. You know, people said, well, you know, the Saudis can't buy parts from China for an for U.S. fighter jets or bombs. Saudi Arabia doesn't need to find parts or fuel or bombs for a U.S. fighter jet because Saudi Arabia can replace that fighter jet with a Chinese drone or a Turkish drone or a Russian drone, you know, for all that, to say that. And so, you know, Saudi Arabia has sent that message as well recently with the talk, you know, if you recall last year, Saudi and China reached a deal to manufacture drones in Saudi Arabia. There's not, I haven't followed the news. I don't know the specific type of drones that would be manufactured in Saudi Arabia, but what's there to say that the latest Chinese armed drones can't be manufactured in Saudi Arabia, for example, right? So, you know, there are a lot of gaps on this for sure. But again, you know, that beyond China is the relationship with Russia, right? Which is a second clear message. I mean, Saudi Arabia is sending three messages to the U.S. administration: relations with Iran, relations with China, relations with Russia. These are the three main rivals at the moment for the U.S. administration.
Well, the problem for the U.S. is even if the administration were to magically change its tune and reorient itself in a different direction, which I do not expect to happen. On the contrary, the Biden administration has been praising the role of China in all of this and has been praising the reconciliation with Iran because it aligns with its own goals. It has been pushing the normalization with Israel, but I don't know who actually believes it can succeed at the moment. Let's say a different administration, a Republican administration, comes back to the White House in 2024, whether or not it is Trump or somebody else, they will be facing the same problem, which is the reality on the ground built over the course of several years. That means Chinese mechanisms and contractors that cannot, and control over communications that cannot be easily disassembled.
Well, a Republican administration would be more hostile toward China, right? So they would throw a wrench in the whole thing. The Biden administration is treading a fine line and not criticizing the relationship between Saudi and China. And then, as you mentioned, you know, playing nice with the Chinese, even though they're aggressive, they're growing aggressively against Taiwan, et cetera, right? So the Biden administration is kind of playing with that nicely, but well, a Republican administration would be worse.
The problem is, even if you start sanctioning various entities, you can't sanction everybody consistently. Sanctions could push Saudis even closer to China because by that point they will no longer need US from a defense perspective. And third, there are many issues that US has not been keeping stock, but if they're already under Chinese control, and there's substantial amount of Chinese influence in various sectors of the economy, with all the desire, it's going to be very difficult to get rid of it. And this is also allowing pro-China to prevail politically in Saudi Arabia. So by the time the next president presumably comes in, if that happens, Biden could get reelected by some.
But always remember that empires overreach, right? Empires eventually overreach. China's new role in Africa, China trying to get into South America, opposition from Canada, opposition from the European Union. There could be at some point where they're overreach, and then we start seeing a realignment or reconsideration of Chinese policy on their own without even the US, increasing the pressure on the Chinese themselves, for example.
That could take a substantial while, and by the time that happens, again, it's one thing to sanction specific individuals, entities, or moves, different way to try to combat economic integration once it has already happened.
Sure.
How do you undo the damage from Chinese control over telecommunications,
Right.
over Chinese involvement in cybersecurity, over Chinese contractors constructing NEOM and all these projects? That is not something easily reversible, nor can you, if it's a relatively peaceful gesture, you cannot just tell another country, well, you can't have Chinese contractors building your city because, you could argue that the political trend will put that pressure, but if there is that much influence, there's only a certain amount of time in the day an administration can spend pressuring Saudis when, as you mentioned, there's also Africa, Latin America right next door, and even domestic issues that are even more exigent.
Right.
But all of that brings us to the final kind of bigger point, which is we are seeing that the Saudi moves have actually been, on the one hand, marking have been somewhat reactionary to U.S. policy over the past years, and I don't mean just Biden, but also advancing their own interests on their own. Iran seems to be benefiting significantly from all of this, regardless of the specific reasons and the long-term plans by any of these actors. Where does that leave smaller countries that have not been part of the direct part of these negotiations, or who have been basically forced to follow suit? We are talking about countries like Bahrain, UAE, which has been largely left out of the peace talks in Yemen. What is the direction do you see them taking, considering that they have been largely a supporter of the southern issues? Do you see them becoming active on humanitarian and economic issues? Do you see them starting their own negotiation process? What do you expect to happen?
Thank you. Someone like the UAE, there's a lot of focus on their military role, or the role that they take in supporting the military in the south, right? From the beginning, from the liberation of Aden in July 2015, right? In the coalition, the UAE was given the area of responsibility in the south, in Aden and across the south. That was the area that they were given within the Arab coalition that was supporting President Abdurrahman Mansour Hadi. And so they built, and traditionally those relationships exist even beyond March 2015, because a lot of Southerners live in the UAE, from Jaffa, from Shabwa. The relationship is there, well rooted. So it was easy for the Southern resistance to communicate with the government in Abu Dhabi and in Dubai. The UAE has also been providing a lot of humanitarian assistance in the southern provinces, right, through the Red Crescent or directly through the government. In Socotra, for example, built hospitals, built housing, funding schools, funding business ventures. And so behind the scenes, they've been fairly active in the humanitarian and economic side. For obvious reasons, they continue to support, to a certain degree, the Southern forces. But let's keep in mind that a lot of the Southern forces don't get their salaries either every month, because the government, the legitimate government, or the Saudi coalition as a leader, does not provide the funds for this personnel, for these soldiers. Definitely, let's recall last year in January of 2022 that the Houthis were attacking the UAE, Abu Dhabi, Dubai, and this was as a result of Houthis losing Bayhan and Shabwa and being pushed back out of southern Marib in January 2022. And so Houthi saw the UAE as the primary supporters, financial, military, political supporters of these forces. So they thought that by attacking Dubai and Abu Dhabi, that then they would pressure the Emirates to pull support for these forces. Once that financial support and military support diminished for the Giants brigades, for example, the Shabwa forces, then the Houthis would be able to, overrun those forces, right? It didn't happen. The southern forces were able to hold the ground and keep the Houthis back. And just this last month, we saw that the Houthis tried to advance into Bayhan and Shabwa again, and they were repelled by the southern forces, the Shabwa forces and the Giants brigades. So definitely someone like the UAE is interested in peace and a role from Iran because of the Houthis, but also because of economic ties, right? The UAE and Iran had extensive economic relations before this conflict and in the billions of dollars, right? And so the UAE would like to get back to get those relations and get that investment and those investment opportunities in Iran themselves, right? But there is still no major, the southern forces welcome the Saudi-Iranian rapprochement in Beijing. The southern political figures made a comment soon after those meetings and praised the peace between Saudi and Iran, because ultimately, yes, it affects the Southerners directly. The Houthis today are primarily targeting the South. They're targeting the oil infrastructure in the South. They're targeting the Southern forces across Azala, Lahaj, Shabwa, and in Southern Marib. And so the UAE would like for peace to prevail, because yes, also it would demand less investment, financial investment on the part of the UAE supporting the southern military against the Houthis, right? Just like the Saudis would decrease the financial military support for the national army against the Houthis if there's a peace deal. So the Emiratis would definitely benefit from a peace agreement between Saudi and Iran, and a peace agreement between the Houthis and the Yemeni rivals. It's a given. The Emiratis seem to remain committed to the southern forces and the southern entity as a balance. If the UAE was not supporting Yemeni factions that are fighting the Houthis could overrun more provinces again, and we're back to the scenario before July 2015, where the Houthis can threaten to march into Aden again from southern Taiz, for example, or could march from Muqaydas and Al-Baida city into Abiyan, which borders Aden and Shabwa. So the support from the UAE is vital, both for the Yemeni government and for the Southerners. The Prime Minister and President Rashad al-Alimi have held talks over the last year with the Emiratis. There is no tension between the legitimate government and the Emiratis, as opposed to years past during the Abdul Rabbu's tenure, where there was some friction there with the Emiratis. The Emiratis can play a more constructive role on the humanitarian side. There's opportunities there to get more involved in the economy and reconstruction. But there's no doubt that their support for the Southern Armed Forces is vital if the goal is to keep the Houthis where they are, at least today. If the interest is to balance against the Houthis, then someone like the UAE can play a major role in the coming months by supporting the Southern forces, who have proven to be the most effective forces against the Houthis. The southern forces have beaten the Houthis. If you recall, in 2018, the Southern Giants brigades pushed the Houthis from Moha and Hoja all the way into the airport at Hodeidah. The southern forces, along with the guards of the Republic, were within a couple of kilometers from entering and taking the city of Hodeidah from the Houthis, and they were stopped by the Stockholm talks under the UN. On the other hand, last year in Shebwa, they were able to remove them, expel them from Behan, from the western Shebwa border, back into Marib and back into Al-Baida. So if there's no other military units in Yemen have been able to push the Houthis back from any position. The Houthis have gained nearly over 30% of the territory in Marib. They are within 10 to 14 kilometers from the city of Marib. They have not been pushed back by the National Army. So if someone has proven effective in the fight against the Houthis, it's been the Giants Brigade, the Shebwa forces, who are then supported by the UAE. So we can clearly say that that support is vital to the Southerners and to the fight against the Houthis.
Nevertheless, and despite UAE's seemingly clear benefit in the settlement of the conflict, UAE and Saudi Arabia have had their share of differences, including recently there's said to be a political rift, and Yemen being one of those issues. What can you tell us about what's going on in that front?
Sure. I mean, you know, I'm Mexican originally, so I often compare these kind of relationships like the U.S. and Mexico. They share a border. They're for eternity. They're going to be neighbors, but they have differences in their political approach to security matters or economic matters. And I think it's similar to Saudi Arabia and the Emirates. You know, these are two major influences in the GCC, two major political and economic powers in the Arab world, in the Middle East. They're not going to see eye to eye on everything. Both of them want a sphere of influence in the region. But I don't think that the tension is at the point where they completely disagree and we're going to see a conflict between Mohammed bin Salman and Mohammed bin
No. But
Zayed,
there is
right?
some difference over the solution of this particular
Sure.
issue. And the question is, what is it exactly? If UAE also wants a settlement of the conflict, what are the terms that they would see that they're not seeing from the Saudis?
Sure. Keep in mind, Saudi Arabia hosts the Muslim Brotherhood, right? The Al-Islam party. The UAE is opposed to the Muslim Brotherhood having a major role in the government because of its own political interests. We see all the way to Egypt. The UAE would definitely like the Southerners to play a bigger role as a balance to the other factions, right? So whether it's the SDC or Iraq, for the Southern factions to play a major role in the government, in order to create again balance with the Houthis. And again, you can see, back to what we talked about earlier, you can see how the UAE is trying to say, we tried the same thing over and over again for 8 years and we were worse in 2023 than we were in 2015, right? So maybe we should let the Southerners play a major role in the government and in negotiation with the Houthis, and maybe we have some sort of change, right? We have a new path or we have new progress, etc., and not have the negotiations with the Houthis be dominated either by representatives of the former regime or by the Al-Islah, the Muslim Brotherhood, right? So we can see how the UAE is pushing Saudi Arabia to accept the SDC a little bit more, to give the SDC a bit more confidence, give them a bigger role in the political leadership council, and maybe that can make a change in the balance and force the Houthis to the table, and peace talks can begin under the UN. This is the only other calculation that I can see, because I know that the Emiratis and the Saudis share the interest in peace in Yemen. There is no disagreement that there needs to be peace and stability in Yemen. It's just maybe perhaps they, have different parties that they would like at the forefront leading the peace efforts, And you can understand how the Emiratis would tell the Saudis, we tried the same people for 8 years. We need new faces. We need new ideas. We need new sources of pressure. Let's see if it works. So I mean, we could expect some changes in the political leadership council structure in the coming months if Saudi Arabia is really committed to pursuing the peace process in Yemen, not just between Saudi Arabia and the Houthis.
Well, thank you so much for these valuable insights that shed a lot of light on the otherwise mysterious seeming developments, especially for most people who have not been keeping track of these long-standing tensions and shifting alliances. I hope everyone watching this continues to follow Fernando's work and also continues to follow the work, the developments in Yemen, in the Middle East. As well. These are important issues, and I have a feeling that we will be hearing about a lot of this soon, whichever way things go. We can expect either major breakthroughs or a reversion to to conflicts and disputes. But it's not going to stay stagnant for long. That's my sense of it. Thank you, everyone watching this. Please join the Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio again next week, same time, 9 p.m. And thank you, Fernando, again. Have a great night.
Thank you very much for inviting me. Thank you very much.